I struggled to open my eyes, the pounding in my head almost unbearable. Maybe it was a sign to skip these late-night parties. This was too much. As I slowly became more aware, I tried to brush the sleep from my eyes, but my right arm wouldn't move, and the pain there was even sharper than in my head. My lower body felt strangely numb. When I tried to call out, my voice barely rose to a whisper. With effort, I managed to reach over with my left hand, hoping my phone was nearby, but it wasn't there. Great. Now what? I lay still, trying to pick up on any sounds to figure out where I might be. I heard cars passing, a bird singing, and even the rumble of a large truck nearby. This definitely wasn't my bed at home. I tried to remember last night. The last thing I recalled was finishing up in the north fields, parking the tractor near the barn, and heading back to the house. Somewhere between the barn and the house, something must have happened. But what? I ran my hand over the ground around me, expecting the feel of grass from the front yard, but instead found loose, powdery dirt. My face felt like a crusty mess, and when I reached up, I realized a large bale of hay was weighing down my legs and part of my stomach. I managed to lift it just enough to wriggle free, feeling pins and needles rush back into my legs, what my sister used to call sparklers. Grateful for the movement, I lay there catching my breath. After taking a moment to assess my surroundings, I figured I was probably in my pole barn, the only place on the farm with powdery dirt like this. I couldn't see anything, but I could still hear traffic to my left, meaning the barn's side door and the phone inside should be to my right. I started inching my way over, stopping when I bumped into the welder. Almost there. The phone should be only a few feet away now. I finally reached the stool it sat on, tipping it over as I grabbed for the phone. The device smacked into my face, but I barely felt it over the ache I already had. I pressed the speed dial button, listening as it began to ring. Relief washed over me when I heard my dad answer. I clicked the phone button in code, hoping he'd remember our old trick. "Bobby, is that you?" he asked. I pressed 3 times. "Are you okay?" 2 clicks. "Are you at home?" 3 more. When he asked if I needed help, I responded with another 3 clicks. Years ago, we'd come up with this code, never thinking I'd be the one to use it. "Hang on, son, I'm coming." My dad must have called the sheriff and an ambulance, because not long after, I heard his truck fly into the driveway. He kicked open the locked barn door and rushed in, phone still in hand. "Make it quick, he's hurt bad," he told someone. I tried to move, but everything went hazy. And the next thing I knew, I was hearing my mom's voice, teasing me about looking extra pretty now. Someone touched me, and the sudden brightness made me groan. Dr. Morgan was there, giving instructions, and all I could do was grunt in response to the poking and prodding. I recognized his voice as he told someone, "He'll be okay, though he might wish he wasn't for a few days." As he left, I heard soft sobs from the corner of the room, and then my dad's quiet voice, telling me I looked rough, but would pull through. His words drifted with me into sleep. Later that evening, my wife Holly burst into the room, her voice harsh with frustration. "I told you to be careful. I had to leave the seminar and fly back because you couldn't handle things while I was gone." No concern, no gentle touch, just an irritated rant. I lay still, pretending to be asleep until she finally whispered, "He looks out cold." A familiar male voice responded quietly, "Can we get out of here?" I couldn't place him, but he seemed close to Holly. The next morning, I was sore but refused to be sedated again. My mom, dad, and sister Cora came during visiting hours. Mom smiled, reassuring me I'd be back to normal soon. I motioned for Cora to sit close, barely finding my voice to tell her, "I think Holly tried to get me killed. She was here with a man last night, and they seemed eager to leave." Cora listened, her face growing concerned as I asked her to help install bugs on the phones and set up a video system around the house and barn, making sure the front lawn was covered too. I also mentioned my missing phone. She promised to get her husband Paul to handle it today. He ran a private detective firm and knew his way around surveillance. When Holly returned later, her tone had changed completely. She was all affection, acting as though nothing had happened. She stayed a couple of hours, mentioning work obligations and her forced return from the seminar. My dad just shook his head after she left, muttering, "What's she trying to prove?" Later, as I rested, the pain became overwhelming, so I asked the nurse for something mild. After drifting off for a few hours, I woke to find Holly beside me, reading the newspaper. I asked her if my accident had made the news. She replied, saying they had reported the bale had fallen on me, calling it a miracle I survived. Reports indicated I had a broken arm, a dislocated shoulder, several cuts, bruises, and a serious concussion. Holly left before visiting hours ended, and around midnight, Cora returned unexpectedly. She'd spoken with the nurse from the night before and heard how oddly Holly had behaved during her visit. The nurse hadn't overheard everything, but she did give a description of the man with Holly. Before Cora could even finish, I knew it was Holly's boss, Felix. Now it made sense why that voice had sounded so familiar. Cora informed me that the surveillance equipment I'd requested was already installed at home. She'd also placed an audio monitor and GPS in Holly's car and planned to do the same with Felix's vehicle. She discovered the only conferences held in Brownsville, Texas that week were for veterinarians and colorectal surgery, events completely unrelated to Holly's real estate job. She was also verifying hotel reservations. The next day, Cora handed Holly a St. Jerome medal, claiming it was for good luck. It was actually a listening device. She gave me one as well, showing a matching one for herself to sell the story. Holly's medal would transmit audio for up to 4 days before needing replacement. On the third day, I planned to ask her to rub it for luck, swapping it for a new one. Later, I had a visit from Derek, a high school friend and the EMT who brought me in. After making sure I was okay, Derek handed over some photos from that morning. He gave them to Cora to hold on to as Holly arrived, looking edgy since her return. Mom and Dad came shortly after, with Dad fussing over delivering Mom's homemade spice cakes to thank the hospital staff. Mom, as ever, looked her whisper-thin self, saying, "The faster you eat, the fewer calories you get." 3 weeks after the accident, I was discharged. Holly was too busy with a house closing to pick me up, so Cora took me home. On the drive, she shared the disappointing results of the investigation so far. Despite the surveillance, we had no solid leads. Cora also revealed that my insurance policy, set up by Holly after we married, was worth $5 million, with Holly as the sole beneficiary. It seemed they were in for the long game. About a month later, Holly's office held their annual barbecue. Since I couldn't drive, Cora brought me, and we arrived fashionably late. For the first 2 hours, Holly didn't even know I was there. As we walked toward Felix's house, I spotted what looked like my cell phone tucked beneath a toolbox in a company truck. I feigned a stumble, grabbing the side of the truck in pain, and Cora leaned in to help, snapping a quick picture before slipping the phone into her purse. The sheriff confirmed later that it was indeed my phone, though strangely, it had only my prints on it. Left alone with too much time, I began noticing things around the house, including a bottle of birth control pills Holly was supposedly no longer using since we were trying for a baby. Despite her insistence, I soon realized that she was still taking them, once a week. Suspicious, I kept the recordings under lock and key, noticing her growing disinterest in our time together despite her efforts to appear cheerful when I was watching. One April afternoon, my dad borrowed my truck and trailer, giving me a rare day off. I decided to sit in my barn office, working quietly. Holly came home for lunch, spotted the missing truck, and phoned Felix, telling him I was out for a while and he could stop by. After confirming I was halfway out, she invited him over. When they began to move things into the bedroom, I made an excuse to call her, claiming truck issues and saying I'd be back soon. I also phoned Cora to bring the sheriff out within half an hour. Hearing the sounds of resistance from Holly, I set up a recorder and waited outside, ice pick and cattle prod ready. Climbing the stairs quietly, I could hear them arguing, but by the time I reached the bedroom, it had gone silent. As they were distracted, I stood near, unnoticed, and held the cattle prod close to Felix's side. When he realized, I pressed the trigger just as he froze in surprise. Neither one had a clue what hit them. Holly fell forward, her face buried in the pillows, gasping as she struggled to catch her breath. Felix, meanwhile, rolled off the bed and lay twitching on the floor. I decided to hit him again with the cattle prod for good measure, watching as he convulsed from the shock. Leaning down close to Holly, I whispered that she would agree to anything I asked, or she could be out of the house that night. She nodded in frightened agreement. Barely 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps charging up the stairs. Cora and the sheriff were here. Felix, now attempting to stand, began yelling, threatening to kill me, and expressing his regret that I hadn't died the first time. I was prepared to shock him again when the sheriff burst through the door, ordering me to drop the cattle prod. Reluctantly, I set it down on the floor and told them it was assault, plain and simple. I mentioned that the whole incident was recorded and Holly, having no real choice, backed up my statement. Felix was found guilty in court, and he was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in state prison. His wife filed for divorce, securing full control of their real estate office in the process. Meanwhile, Holly was terminated from her job, but received a substantial severance payout under the condition of her silence. In an unexpected twist, we discovered Holly was already 2 months pregnant before her time in bed with Felix. Somehow, her birth control pills had failed, likely because she was using placebos. When our daughter was born, we named her Blair. A paternity test confirmed she was indeed my child. Holly and I maintained a civil front for Blair's sake, but as time went on, Holly grew more distant. The following spring, she quietly left town, vanishing without a trace. She took nothing from the house, not even her car or clothes, only her purse. I was out picking up cattle at the time, so I returned home to find our daughter alone in her crib, peacefully asleep. The police launched an investigation into Holly's disappearance, conducting searches around our property, neighboring land, and even with cadaver dogs, but no clues were ever found. After years of silence, I filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. As Blair started kindergarten, I met her teacher Whitney, and we connected instantly. We held off dating until Blair was in 3rd grade, and by October, after harvest season, Whitney and I were married. We built a new family together, welcoming 2 more children, and Blair adored having a new mother and siblings. Years later, during a trip to town for supplies, I caught a glimpse of a familiar walk. A woman exiting the bank with an unmistakable stride of frustration. It was Holly. I watched her climb into the back seat of a large tinted SUV. Recognizing her after all this time was surreal. Quickly, I jotted down the license plate number and reported the sighting to the sheriff. Later that evening, he stopped by to inform me that Holly had attempted to access funds from our shared accounts. However, since our divorce, those funds were locked under court order, requiring official clearance for any withdrawal. Over the years, the court tried to return Holly's portion to me, but I refused, deeming it blood money, and instead set up a trust for Blair's college fund. Other than a few photos, Blair had no memories of her mother, who had left when she was too young to remember her. After the sighting, I contacted Cora, asking her to help reinstate our home's surveillance system. Her husband, Paul, a private investigator, confirmed that only the bedroom cameras had been removed. The rest were still operational, recording over old footage every 36 hours unless motion was detected, which extended recording time. Paul came by to swap out the memory cards and took them for review. He found 2 recent instances where unfamiliar vehicles, a dark blue pickup and the SUV from the bank, entered my driveway, each time with the same men stepping out to look around before leaving. With this information, the sheriff had both license plate numbers and began his own investigation. The next morning, state police arrived at my door, asking questions about Holly, our accident, and my divorce. Later, Whitney, now my wife, mentioned seeing unfamiliar faces around town. Observant as ever, she noted some drove old farm trucks or appeared to blend in as locals, but she knew they weren't from the area. Others were even riding along as assistants on elementary school buses, though they clearly weren't from around here. The following day, the FBI visited, repeating the same questions. This time, they recorded the interview and probed for more specifics. Finally, I had to ask outright if this was related to a kidnapping case and if Holly was involved, but they offered no answer. Frustration grew, especially after I overheard a county deputy mention that a help message was scrawled on the back of a withdrawal slip Holly had submitted at the bank. I wasn't sure if it was even connected, but I called the sheriff to discuss it, asking him to drop by when he had a moment. Next, I asked Paul to verify if Holly's life insurance policy was still active. He confirmed that not only was it in force, but the premiums were fully paid. Something didn't add up, so I dug out old bank statements from the early years of our marriage, combing through them but finding no record of payments for the policy. Curious, I reached out to Rose, Felix's ex-wife, who confirmed that their company had been covering the policy premiums until Felix went to jail. She provided copies of the checks Felix had signed for the payments. I called the sheriff to inform him, suggesting they compare the signature on the policy with my known samples. Within minutes, the FBI collected several old checks of mine for comparison. They sheepishly admitted that they hadn't considered a possible insurance fraud angle. Frustrated by the lack of transparency, I warned them that I was worried for my family's safety and wouldn't hesitate to leave town if they kept me in the dark. The lead agent glared but said he had checked with his superior before disclosing any details. The silence over the next few weeks was unnerving. I could only piece together bits of information from rumors around town. The only concrete news I had was that Holly's withdrawal slip had "help" scrawled on the back. I became increasingly concerned, as it seemed clear that someone, somewhere, was hunting for answers about Holly, and they were turning their attention toward my family and me. I asked if he had reviewed the evidence that put Felix away for the assault. "No," he replied. "Well," I said, "there are hours of recordings between Felix and Holly from before the attack. There might be something in them to help you." It turned out he hadn't known about those tapes either. The next morning, I was summoned to a meeting with him and his boss. They picked me up and drove me to their office, where we sat in a secure conference room. "This conversation is being recorded. Do you need a lawyer? If so, we'll pause until you get one," they offered. "Keep that recorder running until I walk out of here," I said firmly. "I don't need a lawyer, but you might want my brother-in-law Paul to join us. He could provide details I might overlook. Better yet, bring in my sister Cora as well. They're both as involved as I am." The agents exchanged glances, clearly surprised, and moved to stop the recording. "Oh no, you'll keep that running," I insisted. "I have absolutely nothing to hide." They handed me the phone, and I called Cora, who answered from another line in the building. "Cora, it's Bobby. The FBI is recording our call. I need you and Paul to come in and share information about things that happened before my divorce from Holly. If you want to bring a lawyer, feel free." "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Absolutely. You'll understand once you're here." A car was sent for them, and 20 minutes later, Cora, Paul, and their lawyer arrived. Once everyone was introduced, I turned to the agents. "Is this still being recorded?" They confirmed it was. "Good. I believe my life is in danger because of the large insurance policy Holly took out on me. I want to give you as much information as possible about events leading up to our divorce." I turned to the agents and added, "If I'm mistaken, correct me. Otherwise, let's get started." They shrugged, and Agent Nelson replied, "In a nutshell, you're correct." "Great," I said. "Let's start with the accident." I described plowing the fields, parking the tractor, heading toward the house, and waking up in the barn beneath a hay bale, weak from blood loss. I recounted the disturbing conversations between Holly and Felix in my hospital room. "Am I missing anything?" "Let's ensure they have everything they need, including the post-accident photos," I said. Cora spoke up. "We did everything according to the law. Bobby owns the farm outright and requested video and audio surveillance for his own security. We installed 10 motion-activated digital cameras covering the property, ensuring all entries and exits were monitored, as well as the main living areas. We have copies of every recording, except for those in the bedroom." The agents were stunned into silence, their jaws practically on the floor. "Will that information help your investigation?" I asked. They both nodded. One muttered, "Can you copy all the recordings at high speed? There's too much to process using standard methods. We'd prefer copies to originals for safety." "Not a problem," I replied. "If clarity's an issue, you can view the originals any time. We also have the memory card from the camera that took the photos. We can bring it by this afternoon." Agent Warren stepped aside to make a call. I continued, "The bedroom tapes might not be of interest unless you're planning to charge Holly with trying to love me to death. If you need those, you can view them at my place. But you might want the ones showing Felix and Holly together. And don't forget to take copies of the phone recordings." Paul asked if they needed the GPS logs, causing their eyes to widen. "You track their movements too?" one asked, astonished. "Only after the attack," Paul clarified. "Now," I said, "can you tell us anything about your investigation without compromising it?" Cora and Paul are court officers and would lose their licenses if they disclosed anything. Nelson explained, "The 2 license plates are registered to a business in the neighboring state. We're tracking 2 other company vehicles under the same ownership. The sole proprietor is Felix Roberts, recently released on parole about 6 weeks ago. He's required to check in with his probation officer tomorrow, and we plan to plant a tracker on his vehicle then. We suspect he's been hiding since his release. We haven't seen him at either his residence or business." I remained silent, taking in the implications. "You may have noticed unfamiliar faces around town. We have agents monitoring your home, as well as your family's locations. There's additional backup ready to move in if necessary." The discussion turned to the insurance policy. "We just received the original policy this morning. The checks you provided for comparison are en route. Forensics will analyze the handwriting to check for fraud. That's where things stand. Someone knocked and entered with a small device that could copy the memory cards at high speed. Nelson called in and reported no activity at key sites. When our meeting concluded, I was driven home while Cora, Paul, their lawyer, and 4 agents went to Paul's office to copy the recordings. 4 hours later, the FBI had a complete set of surveillance tapes from my farm. They advised me to continue life as usual. The next day, I went to town for supplies, spotting a dark blue pickup with out-of-state plates near the courthouse. As I sat at a red light, a boy, about 15, ran out of the park after a ball that rolled under the truck. He asked the driver if he could retrieve it, and with a nod, slid under the vehicle, briefly reaching into his pocket as he grabbed the frame to pull himself out. He thanked the driver and ran off. It was over in seconds, but I had a good guess. That was no ordinary ball boy. I later learned he was an agent in training. It looked like they had tagged the truck with a GPS. Life continued normally for 3 weeks. I saw 2 more agents around the farm, but the others remained unseen. Then, on a Friday, Agent Nelson arrived at the farm, beaming. "Thanks to your help, we've made significant progress," he began. "We have Mr. Roberts in custody, along with 3 of his associates. We believe we have everyone, and the case is solid." Nelson outlined the charges. Felix faced accusations of murdering his first wife, attempted murder of me, insurance fraud, extortion, blackmail, multiple assaults, embezzling from the real estate company, and the illegal detention of Holly. With these charges, it appeared justice might finally be served, and the layers of deception Felix and Holly had built were unraveling. "We also got him for speeding and running a stop sign," Agent Nelson added with a smirk. "Your ex-wife Holly is now in protective custody as a primary witness. But even without her, this case is rock solid." I asked if Holly would face charges, and he shook his head. When she disappeared, he had her kidnapped. The bank records showed she attempted to access her funds using her old farm address, verified by a notary familiar with the location. That helped pinpoint Felix's hideout through GPS records. 4 months later, the trial began. Holly was heavily protected, only appearing to testify. She endured hours of cross-examination, her voice breaking as she recounted Felix's manipulation and threats. His lawyer painted her as an adulterer and opportunist, but her evidence, especially recordings from a bank visit where she wore a wire, confirmed Felix's threats. Holly revealed how he had blackmailed her with secrets from her past, including adult films she'd done in college to pay for her education. Felix had even arranged her Brownsville trip to ensure she was out of town when his men tried to kill me. His admission to orchestrating that attempt was caught on tape. The insurance fraud extended to a policy taken out on his first wife, whom he'd arranged to have murdered, and a forged application for a $6 million policy in my name. It was surreal listening to the twisted lengths Felix had gone to. Cora and I attended each day of the trial, but Whitney, my wife, couldn't bear it. The testimony disturbed her deeply. Paul also attended, required to authenticate the data and recordings he'd handled. After 2 grueling weeks, the jury deliberated for nearly 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Felix was sentenced to life without parole, with Holly in witness protection, complete with a new identity and appearance. Shortly after his sentencing, Holly contacted me. She apologized, saying how much she regretted everything. I replied that it was too fresh. I needed time. I told her about my love for Whitney, and that there was no chance I could leave her. She asked about my parents and Blair, our daughter. I shared that Blair was thriving in school and adored Whitney, who she called Mom. I explained that Blair was aware she had a different birth mother, though she didn't know the details yet. Holly asked if she might meet her one day, and I suggested she call me on my birthday in a year to discuss it. Over the following months, I slowly introduced the idea of her birth mother to Blair with Whitney's support. We wanted her to feel secure and ready. Eventually, Blair admitted she'd always been curious about her other mother. Whitney gently explained that Holly had been taken from her against her will and had never wanted to leave. Blair struggled with the idea, but assured Whitney she loved her deeply. After a heartfelt conversation, Blair told me she was ready to meet Holly, even saying, "I hope I can love her too." A week before my birthday, Agent Nelson visited me at the barn. He informed me that Felix had been killed in a prison fight, along with his accomplices. If Holly wishes, she could safely return with her new identity, he said. I thanked him, explaining that I hadn't yet spoken to Holly, but would soon, as she was scheduled to call on my birthday. After Nelson left, I shared the news with Whitney and showed her the video from the agent. "I love you more than life," I said, "and I'd never want to hurt you. But this complicates things. I want us to decide together what's best for Blair." I suggested we discuss it over dinner that weekend, away from the children. Whitney agreed, and we arranged an overnight stay in the city, dropping Blair and the other kids with my parents. At dinner, tension simmered between us as we both weighed the gravity of the situation. We finished eating and took a walk through a small park near our motel. After a while, I broke the silence, asking Whitney how she felt about handling this new development. "Blair's old enough to understand a lot," Whitney said thoughtfully. "I think meeting Holly could help her, but we need boundaries and a plan that puts Blair's well-being first. Whatever happens, I know you'll handle it with love and care." We both agreed to let Holly and Blair meet, but with gradual introductions and careful guidance. Whitney's understanding reassured me. It was clear she held Blair's happiness above any personal reservations. That night, we talked through every detail, laying out a plan that felt right for our family. When Holly called on my birthday, we would be ready to set up that first long-awaited meeting. Whitney began outlining her plan. "When we meet Holly, we should choose a neutral, fun place where none of us have been before. Since it's November, maybe somewhere warm. Blair could talk to her on the phone first to ease into things. If all goes well, we could even ask Blair what she thinks about next steps." I nodded, impressed by her thoughtfulness. Whitney went on, "If things work out, maybe we could even build her a small place where our property meets your folks. If not, we could find her a spot in town for visits. But if she doesn't make things comfortable, we can say goodbye and only allow cards and letters. For Blair's sake, I hope she makes a good impression." "I agree," I said. "We don't need to decide everything on the first visit. If things feel strange, we can take it slow." We kissed and held each other, our minds lost in thought. That night, we clung to each other tightly, and in the morning, we shared a passionate moment, as though our lives depended on it. Later, as we drove home, we couldn't help but feel closer and more in love. When Holly called on my birthday, we discussed plans for a meeting. We settled on Disney from December 27th to just after New Year's, a relaxed place to get to know each other again. I put the call on speaker and invited Blair to join, holding tightly to Whitney's hand. Blair hesitated, torn between excitement and nervousness. Holly gently said, "Hello, Blair. I've waited so long to meet you." Blair, in a soft voice, asked, "Are you my other mommy?" Holly's voice caught with emotion as she replied, "Yes, I gave birth to you, and I know your daddy told you how I was taken away. I'd love to spend some time with you, your daddy, and your other mommy. Would you like that?" Blair nodded shyly. Holly then told her, "Your daddy arranged for us to meet at Disney. I'm counting the days." Blair's tentative smile grew. "Mommy Holly, I hope I'll love you as much as I love my other mommy and daddy." Holly's quiet sobs turned into joy as Blair said goodnight. The days leading up to Christmas were full of excitement. Blair opened up more about her feelings toward Holly, and she and Whitney had honest talks. After a doctor's visit, Whitney surprised me with the news that we were expecting again. At Christmas dinner, we shared our joy with the family. And my dad, ever the joker, whispered to my mom, "Think he's figured out what causes it yet?" Arriving at Disney a day early, I spotted Holly checking in. I pointed her out to Whitney and Blair. That night, Whitney and Blair went for a walk, crossing paths with Holly in the rose garden. They exchanged polite greetings without revealing who they were. Back in the room, Blair beamed, telling Whitney, "My mommy Holly is real pretty, but not as pretty as you." The next day, at a stage show, I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I saw Holly. As the show ended and the crowd thinned, I gently directed Blair toward her. "Hello, Holly." "I'm glad you made it," I said. Holly looked at Blair and Whitney, her eyes welling up. "I saw you last night in the garden. I never dared dream that beautiful girl was Blair." "Blair," I said, "this is your birth mother. And Whitney, meet Holly." In that moment, emotions ran high. Tears, hugs, and words blending into a beautiful, chaotic reunion. We stood together, feeling both like long-lost friends and new ones, connected by Blair's bright smile and innocent excitement. Finally, the ushers asked us to clear the area, and we left, forming a tight little family circle. Finding a bench outside, we sat down, continuing our conversations with laughter and tears. The first meeting had gone as well as we could have hoped, and Blair seemed happier than ever to have both her mothers in her life. Holly raised her hand, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm truly amazed by the love I feel here. I threw away my chance with a wonderful man because of pride and vanity. If you allow me any place in your lives, I'll be eternally grateful. Blair, Whitney, I can see the love between you. If I'm allowed even a small part of it, I'll be at peace." Tears streamed down her face. Blair walked over, gently took her hand, and said softly, "Please don't cry. Everything will be all right." She embraced Holly and then looked to Whitney, inviting her to join the hug. Blair kissed each on the cheek, reassuring Whitney, "I love you so much, but I hope it's okay if I love Mama Holly a little too." Whitney smiled, holding them both close. That evening, we each returned to our rooms, exhausted from the day's emotions. The next morning, Whitney and Holly took a walk together, returning 3 hours later with warm smiles. Over lunch, Holly and I talked about forgiveness and putting the past behind us, agreeing that our feelings needed to stay as memories. I shared how I'd mourned her loss, only to learn later that she hadn't left by choice. Holly admitted her regret over past mistakes and expressed admiration for how well Blair had turned out. After another day at Disney, Whitney suggested a private meeting that night. When Holly arrived at our suite, she looked nervous. We offered her water, and Whitney gently asked, "Are you happy where you live?" Holly hesitated. She admitted her neighborhood was fine, but she felt isolated. Whitney then asked if she'd consider moving back nearby. Confused and unsure, Holly listened as I explained. "We'd like to offer you a place on our property, a corner lot where you'd have privacy and could see Blair often." Tears filled her eyes, and she reached out to hold both our hands. After a moment, she said, "I can't believe you're making this offer, but I have to turn it down. I'd feel too exposed." She explained that since her abduction, she was constantly on edge, unable to feel safe in open spaces. Whitney nodded, understanding. "Is there a spot on the farm that might feel more secure?" I suggested a spot by the kennels near the bullpen. The area was fenced and close enough to keep an eye on. Holly considered it, smiling as she realized it might work. She suggested applying for a mother-in-law or tenant permit, so she wouldn't need ownership, just a safe place to be near family. 2 months later, Holly sold her house, left her job, and moved into a small, secure spot behind our home. She became our children's caregiver, her idea to help make up for lost time with Blair. She attended church with us as Janet, Whitney's cousin, blending easily into our community with her new identity. One of the sheriff's deputies even took an interest in her, but Holly politely declined, saying she'd had her one true love. That spring, Blair graduated from high school. When she learned about the money Holly received as severance, she insisted it be divided among all the children for education. Holly happily agreed, adding a bit extra for Blair as a gesture of love. Now, surrounded by a family who cares deeply for her, Holly has finally found peace. She often says that she no longer wants for anything and feels grateful every day. Whitney remains my true partner, and while Holly is a cherished friend, my heart belongs to Whitney alone.